Hi, I'm Theresa Badurek. I'm your urban horticulture extension agent, and that's just a mouthful of words to say that I take information from the University of Florida, science-based information, and I bring it here to our communities. And we do this every day. So I'll be teaching this class at a library in a week or so. So I want to thank you guys for coming today. I also happen to be a certified arborist, and as we touch on trees a lot in this presentation, I just thought it was important for you guys to know that. So today we're going to talk about storm resilient landscaping, and we are getting close to hurricane season. I'm sorry to have to bring that up. I wonder if that's why we only have a portion of our registered participants. So a bunch of people may have gotten scared off. They started thinking about hurricane season and decided they didn't want to think about hurricane season. We had a rough one last year, didn't we? Okay, so we're going to talk about all kinds of things that we think about in the landscape that are going to hopefully save us time, money, and even prevent damages to our property. And so we're going to go ahead and dive in here. By the way, if you guys have questions, you can put them in the chat box, but I do have time at the end where we can set aside a little bit of time and you can ask some more specific questions when we're done. So trying to get my slides to work, but they're being a little slow. There we go. So why do we care about this? You guys, if you were here during this last hurricane season, you know all too well why this is important. Hurricanes and tropical storms, and even just summer thunderstorms. Really, this even applies in many cases to an everyday thunderstorm. They can cause all kinds of damage, flying debris, wind and water. And by doing some things in advance, we can help, save you some time and money in either fixing or replanting, as it works. If you have ever had damage to your home and you've had to work with a homeowner's insurance company, you may have discovered that our homeowners insurance policies typically do not cover any of your landscaping. So, for example, if your entire landscape gets destroyed in a hurricane and you have to buy thousands of dollars of plants to re-landscape, there is no coverage for that. There can be exceptions. You can buy additional insurance specific to this, but it's not a standard part of your homeowner's insurance. So for me, that's really important because most of us after a storm are dealing with deductibles and damages. And, my power went out and I lost hundreds of dollars of food in the refrigerator. And the very last thing I want to worry about when all that's said and done is, $7,000 in re-landscaping my landscape. So another thing to think about is if a tree falls during the storm, but doesn't land on anything, the tree you see in the picture here, if it doesn't damage something, land on your roof, land on a shed, land on a car, typically that is not covered. So having that tree cut up and removed, which could be thousands of dollars, is not paid for by your homeowner's insurance. So these are the reasons why we talk about these things now and just kind of make you aware of those things going into another storm season. These are just some images of things that can happen and the main risks involved in these storms. Your high winds, of course, they can uproot trees, they can blow down fences, carports, pool enclosures, etc. They come with heavy rainfall at times. Sometimes that comes with flooding that will, oftentimes our flooding won't impact your home, thank goodness, but it will flood your landscape very quickly. When you get 2 feet of rain in 48 hours, even our sandy soils in many places can't absorb that much water that fast. And so even if you're not in a flood zone, you can end up with flooding in your landscape. You can actually get debris, flying debris, or in the case of a flood, the sand that washes in on a storm surge can damage your property. And so there's quite a few different risks to think about. Some of them are overhead, some of them are going to come up from, the water below, and you kind of have to just be aware of the different types of risks that we're up against when it comes to a storm. And again, some of these can be an afternoon thunderstorm in July. We've had that heavy rainfall and had these issues. So the most important thing you can do now is figure out, look around your landscape. And when I say landscape, this could include if you live in a single family home, that's all the property outside your house. But this could also include folks in townhouses or condos. You still have a balcony, you still have a patio, and this applies to those spaces as well. Often those are more protected perhaps than an open yard, but not always. And so it's important for you to walk around those spaces now when it's a beautiful, sunny, albeit hot day outside, and decide what are the possible hazards. Are there tall trees? Do I live on a pond that tends to overflow in heavy rains? And kind of make a list of what are all the potential hazards so that, in the next step, you can learn some of the ways to mitigate those issues. The other thing is, what can you do now? Before a storm approaches, what can you do in the landscape to make improvements to make it safer before a storm comes? And then you can also begin to make notes or mental notes on what would you maybe do differently if you either had damage, like from the last storm. Let's say you're looking at re-landscaping and you're hoping to prevent, creating future problems for yourself. And so now is a really good time to do that. In this picture, you can see a tree that was blown. It was actually there was a tornado embedded in, I think this was from Hurricane Milton. And you can see that the tree actually got twisted and bent, but some of the other hazards, you can see there's some other hazards in the picture here. They had, there's a rain barrel there, which we don't know if that blew there. We had bags of mulch. Those were probably stacked up in the yard. So all of these everyday items around your house that are pots and mulches and bags of fertilizer or what have you, these are all things you need to think about long before a storm comes. All right, so we're going to start kind of with some of the, I'm going to say bigger things, your trees and your shrubs, because those are your biggest hazards in the landscape besides, the bay flooding. Obviously, you can't change a lot about that. But you do have trees and shrubs that there are things that you can do to keep them better maintained and to improve the odds of them surviving, hurricane or storm damage. So the first thing you want to do is walk around and look at your trees and shrubs. And on the smaller plant material, where, you can do this yourself with hand tools and you don't have to get up on a ladder and it's not treacherous. So on your smaller trees and shrubs, you can always prune out any dead branches that are weak, like let's say you can see there's rot at the end of a branch, or if two branches are rubbing and crossing each other, you can always prune those back. And you should do so before storm season, because those are the first branches that are going to break loose or tear and either damage the plant further or fly off and into your window or your pool cage or some other expensive thing on your property or your neighbor's property. So this is the time to be doing that. So just walk around and looking for those things. The diagram on the right where you see the multiple cuts. This is a diagram that shows you how to make a safe cut. And again, this is for you. I'm not talking about the big trees that you're going to need to hire somebody to do work on, but this is for you as the homeowner, the resident there taking care of the smaller trees. This 3-cut method is made to keep on a larger cut, like even an interlarger branch, where you would be worried about the weight of the branch. If you were to just make a straight cut off of that to cut that branch off, then you might risk the weight of that branch as it pulls and breaks loose. It could actually tug and rip bark down off of that tree. And so this 3-cut method helps to alleviate that weight. And as you can see, there's a lot of stuff I can send you guys on proper pruning. If you want like some fact sheets you can print out and take home with you, just let me know. In the end, you'll have my email address. But the general idea is you can see that first cut where it says undercut. So you always avoid this collar. Do you see where it says leave collar intact? So that swelling where the branch meets the trunk, you always want to leave it intact. You do not cut into that. So I was saying don't make flush cuts. Never cut into that because that contains, we'll just call it a bunch of compounds and structures that help prevent decay in the main trunk of that tree. If you were to cut into that, you're you're potentially damaging the tree. So you want to make this first cut a little away from that as an undercut. And then you're going to go a couple inches out past that where you can see the second cut on top. And you're going to make a little half cut. So you're going to cut halfway through the bottom of the branch and halfway through the top. And then you can make your final cut, which is just outside of that collar. And this is for, again, small trees and large shrubs so that you can make safe cuts without tearing. Now, if you have larger trees that have dead branches, weak branches, large branches over your roof, maybe that you're concerned about and you need someone to look at, that is when you need to contact a certified arborist. And by certified arborist, I mean somebody that actually holds the credential certified arborist that can only be granted through the International Society of Arboriculture. And if you'd like to find somebody, that QR code with the cute little dinosaur there, if you scan that with your phone, it will take you to the ISA's website where you can put in your zip code and it'll produce a list of arborists that you can contact. And these folks are trained in tree health and proper structure and proper pruning. And little known fact, to open a tree service and to wield a chainsaw and to prune people's trees, you don't have to be a certified arborist. And so this is by asking for these credentials, it's a good way to know that they have the training and the knowledge to have better tree care and to take better care of their tree's health and structure so that they're going to do better in these storms. So that's one thing that you can do again on smaller things. Oh, so I have a question here about why do you have to do those first two cuts and not just the final cut? And so I just wanted to reiterate, you do those first two cuts because what will happen then if the branch is very heavy, which you wouldn't necessarily see in this diagram, this is a very long, heavy branch, that weight can pull down. If I just made that one last cut, the weight could pull before I was able to make a clean cut, and it risks tearing into the trunk and the bark below that cut. And so by doing these top cuts, you might have a little failure out on the end there, but then you reduce the weight and you can make that last cut safely. If that makes sense to you. Sometimes you have to see it in a video, and I could probably send you links to that too if we need to later. Let me go to the next page here. Something else that we can do if you have like a high value large tree in the landscape, and this can be done on smaller plants yourself, but even on larger trees, is something we call thinning the canopy. And that can allow more airflow through the canopy of the tree. So the canopy is that leafy area at the top. And so if we are skillfully and with much training education, pruning it properly to thin it, you can actually allow for air to flow through the tree and not harm it. And so in this diagram, the top three trees are showing the full leaf canopy as a white, those white blobby structures. The bottom three are the same tree, except now they've taken the leaves away so you can see the branches and sort of how that would look. So right in the middle where it says start here, and you see the unpruned tree with foliage right here. What you want to do at the end towards this green happy smiley face is to cut out little bits throughout. So you're not cutting out all the weight on the branches. You're cutting out a little bit, but you're leaving lots of interior foliage. This is very, very important. So the idea would not be to open it all the way up. It's just to barely open it up and thin this out. It's kind of like when someone's hair thins. You don't necessarily have huge open spots. It just looks thinner where you can kind of see a little bit of light through the branches, but not really. That would be the end goal. What we do not want to do, what we never want to do, is what's over here on the left where it says improper pruning and has the big red circle with the X through it. So where it says improper thinning, this is where somebody has gone in and whoever did this just didn't know about tree structure and wind and physics, and they cleaned out all but the little bit at the ends of all the branches. And then there's another term for that. It's called lion's tailing. And lion's tailing actually makes it weaker in a windstorm. And you're like, well, why would that be? And that goes back to physics. What happens is each one of those long branches with nothing but a little bit of leaf stuff at the end, it essentially becomes a sail. And so the idea would be to distribute the wind and let it buffer through an open canopy, but distribute it throughout and not have all the weight of the tree concentrated on the ends where it's going to catch the wind. So if you hire somebody, again, make sure that they're a certified arborist and make sure that they understand what you want if you're going to have the trees thinned, and make sure they don't do this lion's tailing thing that you see on the left. That is extremely harmful to the tree. And what actually ends up happening is that all that empty space in the middle, the tree has a huge stress response to that, and it fills it in with really, really fast growing, weakly attached sprouts. And so over years, it becomes less and less and less wind resistant. So just be very careful that you're getting the right information there. And that, again, you have a certified arborist doing work like this. But you could have a small tree in your landscape, and you might want to do this yourself. So it's important to understand that yourself. All right. So you're doing all this wonderful tree and shrub maintenance in the landscape, and you've created all this lovely yard waste. Our photo-friendly program would love it if you compost a lot of this stuff on site, but we all understand that sometimes there's just too much debris, and you're going to be putting this curbside to be taken away by the waste trucks. And so just be sure, and especially now going into storm season, that you are disposing of that debris properly and regularly. You do not want to, weekend warrior it 3 weeks in a row and have mountains of debris that they won't take, and then all of a sudden a storm sneaks up on us. And now you have tons and tons of debris piled up, and they're not coming anymore because the storm is imminent. So just make sure throughout the storm season that as you're doing the work, that you're putting that material out or taking it, if you take it to the waste management site yourself, just make sure you're doing that on a regular basis so that you're not caught with this situation curbside as a tropical storm or hurricane is headed our way. Your neighbors will thank you too, because that stuff will all end up all over the street and on top of the car and on top of the roof and through a window, So this is very important that we're doing that in a timely manner. We also need to walk around the landscape and figure out, what are we going to do with all this cool yard stuff that we have? You've got yard ornaments and pink flamingos and patio furniture and sandboxes for the kids. We walk around your yard, and if you like to be outside, you probably have all kinds of fun, cool stuff out there. Now, remember, every time a storm is coming, you've got to find a place for that stuff to go, and make sure that you have time to do it. I know as employees, we're always told to have a plan for our family, to make sure that we have our home secured, a place for our pets to go, etc. And your landscape should be part of that too, because again, these things could end up flying through a window, and they're expensive too. So even if they don't cause further damage, your items themselves can get damaged. So find a spot ahead of time, like, okay, I'm going to have room in the garage because I'm going to have to pack up and evacuate anyway. So my car won't be there. So I can put my barbecue grill and my paddle boards and my potted plants in the garage. And so just make sure you have room for all of those things and that you plan that extra time to move those things in before a storm. And you will be thankful, because a lot of these things really add up. A patio set, a kayak, a grill, you're looking at probably a couple $1,000s right there that could be damaged in one storm. But all you had to do was put them in your garage to save yourself. The other thing you're going to want to do if you have these things in your landscape is to also check your fences, your trellises, your sheds. So you're looking around for any repairs that might need to be done, because an old fence that's already rickety is a fence that's more likely to fail. So check all of the gate enclosures, check for rotting boards, check for places where nails or screws are missing, and walk around the landscape and make a plan to repair those now before the storm comes. A lot of these things in our landscape do withstand, decent, strong storms if they're in good repair. And in terms of sheds, you might even consider adding hurricane straps or strapping them down somewhere in the landscape to prevent them from blowing over or blowing away. Make sure the door can be secured well. Some sheds don't come with like a locking mechanism, or maybe it's old and broken. So definitely look at that and consider upgrading any of those things that needs to be repaired ahead of time. Because again, I don't know if you shopped for sheds, but they're expensive, and you definitely want to protect the one that you have if you have one. All right, so we've talked about your trees and shrubs. We've talked about your furniture. All of these things are a little more obvious because they're more expensive and they're larger, but there's also stuff at the ground level that you really want to be paying attention to and think, oops, and thinking, I just got knocked out. Hang on a second. We'll get back here. Please hold. I apologize for that. I must have pressed the button wrong. Come on. Okay, so we're back. Something that a lot of folks don't always think about is the stuff at ground level. So grasses and ground covers and things like that. Those can be really key and important in preventing erosion. So again, those heavy, heavy rains, this applies not just for hurricanes, but just in our heavy downpours here in Florida, that we make sure that we have ground covers to cover the ground, absorb water, hold water, and to keep dirt and debris and mulch from running off. So if you don't have an area landscape with some kind of ground cover going into storm season, now is the time to really plan how you're going to get that covered, because bare ground is more likely to erode and wash away. If you have a lawn, it's very important to keep that healthy, to make sure that it's draining well, to make sure you're not overwatering. We're going to be into the rainy season. I know that's hard to believe right now because it's very dry, but definitely you want to make sure that you're taking good care of your lawn. A healthy lawn is going to be able to withstand summer storms, even potentially flooding from a bigger storm if it goes into it healthy. Something that we also want to note is we have a fertilizer ordinance here in Pinellas County, and what day is it? May 21st. You've got until the end of the month if your landscape plants need any kind of fertilization. Now, our mature landscapes do not need regular fertilization ever. That is a myth. We do not need to regularly fertilize a mature ornamental landscape. We would be looking to fertilize if plants are in need of fertilization. So if your turf grass has an issue, like a nutrient issue, then now would be a good time to fertilize it. Be sure you don't fertilize it before a heavy storm. That's part of the fertilizer ordinance as well, but we're not allowed to apply a lot of the general fertilizers going into the storm season. So again, this is something to plan now before the end of May, because once we hit June 1st, we don't have access to a lot of the different fertilizers. And then if your turf grass was deficient in some sort of nutrients, it would need to wait until the fall. Another thing you can consider is how can you direct water away from your home? And so not just for the health of the plants necessarily, but to preserve your home from damage, your foundation from damage. And potentially, if you design it really well, you could prevent your home from flooding in heavy rain events. You probably couldn't do a whole lot about major storm surge, right? But certainly rain events, you could do something with that. So there are a couple of tools. One would be called swales, and a swale is just a low spot in the landscape that you create and you direct it a certain way so that as water is coming down a hill, for example, you can build high spots that are called berms and low spots that are called swales, where you're directing the water downhill. And you can just literally build it around the sides of the houses, 2 swales around the side of a house to direct the water, from the backyard to the front yard or the front to the back, so that it doesn't pile up in the garage, let's say. So that's something where you have to step back, watch where the water lands in a rainstorm, or remember from previous storms, and strategically think how you could actually dig out the soil and pile up the soil in gentle little curves to redirect that water a little bit. It also is a good idea that possibly if you have a low spot that generally tends to flood anyways, to consider building a rain garden. And a rain garden is just a place that you set aside, and it's either a low spot naturally, or you dig it out a little bit to make a low spot yourself. And then you fill it with plants that are flood tolerant. And there's a list, and if you want to reach out to me after the presentation, we've got information on plants that would be appropriate in a rain garden. And these plants in Florida can tolerate being inundated at times during rainstorms. And then some of them are even drought tolerant, so they can deal with long stretches without water in between. And so that allows for, it's like a little retention pond on your site. It allows for water to pool and sit in an area that won't be harmed by that. And then finally, I just want you all to really be thoughtful about the mulch that you use. Mulches come in a variety of materials. You can get pine straw mulch, you can get wood chips, you can, people will even use shell or rock, but I would definitely advise you in two things. Number one, shells, gravel, and rocks can become missiles in a windstorm. So they literally get picked up by the wind and they can get blown all over and cause more damage. As you can imagine, if you had gravel that got picked up in a windstorm and then got sprayed all over the cars parked in your driveway, that could create a lot of damage. So please consider not using gravel, rocks, or shell for mulch. There's other reasons too that we get into that are more related to plant health. It's just not a good mulch to use. But certainly when we're looking at being, storm ready, we really want to avoid the rocks and the mulch and the shells. So you should think about that when you're planning or if you're planning to replace things. This picture, as you can see here, this picture could be on an afternoon thunderstorm. This could be during a hurricane. Some of you may have conditions like this in your landscape. And this is something that, these are low spots that if somebody had redirected this, they could have created a rain garden. Possibly this is a hurricane event that no one could have planned for, but there are other things you can do. So the biggest things is you want to ensure that you have the grading moving water away from the structure. And a lot of times you can do that yourself, but you might have to, if you have a serious water issue, like I would say this person does that was pictured here, you might even need to work with like a landscape architect or an engineer to think of bigger ways to move water away from that site. Smaller things you can do though, including make sure that your gutters are clear before the rainy season. I know that lots of us have oak trees, and in the springtime, oak trees drop pretty much all their leaves slowly as they grow new ones. And if you have an oak tree, you know how much leaf litter that can be, and your gutters and your drains and downspouts might still be full of oak leaves right now. So if you haven't had the opportunity yet, consider this your reminder to clean out those gutters and downspouts. And then the other thing you want to remember is when we're getting into the storm season, please don't overwater. It rains already. Once we start the rainy season, it rains regularly. Most of us, if it's raining 3/4 of an inch or more a week, you do not need to irrigate at all. So most of us can turn off our automatic irrigation systems whenever the rainy season begins and leave them off until the rainy season is over in the fall, typically. Keep an eye on that. But the last thing you want to do is say your irrigation day is Monday and there's a hurricane coming on Wednesday. Please make sure that your irrigation does not come on Monday, because the last thing you want to do is soak your ground right before a hurricane is coming, because then you're going to exacerbate that kind of flooding. And so just these little things to think about, to remember, and put on that list of things to do as you're walking around your landscape. Okay, turn off the irrigation. The next part that I'm going to talk about here is talking about if you have new choices to make in the landscape. So let's say you're going to do a little landscape design. Let's say maybe you had damage from last year's storms and you're looking to replant, replace, and you're thinking, what should I do? I don't want to lose plants in the future. Some of the things that you can do, you can see here, number one with trees, especially the larger the plant material, the larger the tree, is you want to make sure you're picking wind resistant trees. And I know what some people are thinking, and they're thinking, well, no, I really want a pretty tree with purple flowers and delicious fruit or whatever. And I can very much appreciate that. But when we have limited landscapes and limited budgets, limited time, we want to make sure that the trees we plant will be long-lived, low maintenance. And so I always encourage folks that core structure of larger trees, please try to make sure they're wind resistant. Make sure you don't plant them too close to the building. I know we have small lots in Pinellas. It's a very urban county. If you have an eighth of an acre, that's a good lot size here, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for very large trees. And so when you're looking at planting trees and you have a very limited space, look at planting smaller trees so that the mature size might be only 20 or 30-foot canopy, but that can still provide lots and lots of shade and beauty. And so make sure you're thinking of those things when you go forward. And there's some resources for this. The QR code that you see on the screen here will take you to a fact sheet on subtropical and tropical tree species. This is from the University of Florida. They evaluated them through several past hurricanes for wind resistance. And you can read the study if you want, but at the end, there's about 4 or 5 different tables that are lists of trees ranked from highest wind resistance to lowest of the ones they tested. So you can take a look and see, where do your species lie within that list? And what species would you plant if you needed to plant a new species? And then I just kind of pulled some of them from that list here. You see on the slide on your screen that says highest wind resistance. This is not the full list, but these are ones that I pulled from the list because they are probably easier to find at the nursery. These are mainly native, but not entirely natives, and really have the highest wind resistance on that list. And so, if you're looking for a small tree, something like a buttonwood or even a cocoa plum, were really good choices for wind resistant trees. If you have room for something bigger, live oak and sand live oak are 2 of our most wind resistant large tree species. And if you're looking at adding palms that are wind resistant, our native cabbage palm, also known as the sable palm, also our state tree, is very, very hurricane resistant. And that's what's pictured here in front of this house on the slide is after a hurricane, and those are all sable palms you can see. You can tell they look a little battered, but they're in great shape. They withstood the storm. You can see some other trees on the ground didn't make it. And so those are an excellent choice. Also good for wildlife. Always plugging for the wildlife. Well, what about if you have to worry about more than just wind? What if you have flooding to think about? And so everybody's landscape is going to be a little bit different. And if you've lived in your house for a while, you have a pretty good idea now, especially if you were here through the last storm season. You have a pretty good idea of, am I going to get flooding? And is it going to be fresh water because the lake in the neighborhood overflowed? Or is it going to be salt water because I live near a canal and the storm surge backed up in that canal and then bubbled up through the storm drains and into everybody's landscapes? So you're going to have to decide, what is your biggest threat? Is it fresh water or is it salt water? For many of us, it may be both at the same time, which is extra challenging. And when you're planting new plants, you're going to need to find things that tolerate, inundation. So that's time underwater. That QR code you see here will take you to the Florida Friendly app. You can use it on your computer. You can use it on your phone. You can actually download it as an app. And it's very cool because it has the ability to filter. When you go to the site, it has the ability to custom filter many, many things. So your growing zone, your sun, shade, your soil pH, if you know it. It even has things like what kind of, is it saltwater tolerant? Is it flood tolerant? And so if you have an area that floods with fresh water, then you only have to worry about the flood tolerance. If you have an area that is saltwater flooding prone, then you need to make sure you're checking off that filter that it is both saltwater and flood tolerant. I'm going to be very honest with you. If you live in that condition where you're really near the water, the list of plants that's going to survive that does get smaller and smaller. And so at some point you have to decide, maybe you're going to plant some things that aren't as tolerant and keep them in pots that maybe you can move in to get away from the storm. And so sometimes we have to employ a couple of different strategies to get through these. And so this is just a tool. I didn't give you a list here because there's too many possible conditions out there, but this app allows you to select your specific conditions to do that. You can put your zip code in on the app, or you can pick your USDA hardiness zone. And here in Pinellas County, we're all in zone 10. So North County and inland is zone 10A, and coastal Pinellas and South Pinellas is zone 10B. So just make a note of that. 10, it's an easy number to remember. So whenever you're searching for plants, look for zone 10. What about the surge? This is a terrible picture. This is from Hurricane Ike. Uh, there's nothing, although I do see some sable palms, that's funny in the picture. There's nothing you can plant, though, by the way, that's really going to survive if it's that bad. And so I'm not here to tell you that picking these plants is going to be the magic solution that will save you all the money and your landscape will be beautiful and perfect. There will be times where the motion of the water, if there are waves, and if there's just enough water that none of your plants are going to make it, and we're not worried about that anymore. But everything short of that, when you look at a lot of the pictures post-storm here, we see a lot of our native plants survived it. And again, if they were salt and flood tolerant species, they will often survive it, or they come back. So they look terrible. They look like they died, but they're back soon after or within a few months after. So it's super important to pick those flood and salt tolerant species. And I'm going to give Sydney, I have a list of surge, what I call them, surge resistant species that we put together. And so she can email that out with this presentation for you guys. So you can, if you live in an area where you're surge prone, then you can start to think about better plant selection for that area. Another thing that a lot of people don't think about is their edible gardens going into a storm like this. And the biggest problem with hurricane season is flooding. And what happens in our edible gardens, in our floodwaters, as you guys sadly know now, is often many contaminants. And those contaminants might be bacterial, they may be chemical, they may be all the contents of your neighbor's garage, the pesticides, the gasoline, whatever. You saw it, it's not clean water. If you had an edible garden that was inundated by that flood, that food is no longer safe. And in fact, it would be very difficult to determine the safety of the soil there. For bacteria, 3 or 4 months is typically what we look at, but with unknown chemical contaminants, there's no real timeline. And so what is really recommended in that case, you move back in post-flood, you want an edible garden again. The only proven safe way to do that, anytime soon after a flood, and that could include several years. We don't know if there's not a specific timeline because you don't know what the contaminants are, would be to build a raised bed and bring in soil, clean soil from another site that wasn't flooded, create that new soil. The other thing you have to think about is if it was just salt water, like if you happen to know it was clean, and I don't know if that's possible, salt water, what you can do is flush the landscape out, flush the garden out with fresh water after the saltwater event. And usually that will flush the salt through the soil. And finally, you have to know where your water is coming from, your water supply safety. And we don't ever want to use reclaimed water on our edible gardens. So you need to use well water or potable water. We also cannot use rain barrel water because there's a lot of contaminants on your roof and heavy metals. And so our water supply in the veggie garden should be potable water or well water. And you do have to consider the fact that after a major hurricane, sometimes wells can be contaminated also. So just be mindful of that coming out of this if you have edible gardens, and maybe planning for the future. Maybe your edible garden was in the backyard that got really, really flooded. Perhaps after the storm, you want an edible garden. If the front yard is on higher ground and less likely to flood, that might be a more appropriate place for that. If the homeowners association will allow it. But just be mindful of where you're putting that garden, and can it be elevated, or could it be in earth boxes and self-watering planters that you could pick up and put in the garage in the event of a storm. Just strategies to save your time and money. After a storm, obviously we're checking for down power lines. You don't go near those. Don't even try to figure out what they are. That's when you call the local utilities and you wait until they're done. After that, if that is clear or you don't have power lines or lines to deal with, you want to walk around your landscape afterwards and assess what's going on, make your repairs. always be mindful too that after a storm, there might be a lot of displaced wildlife, snakes and other critters that went to high ground, and your yard might be that high ground. And so I want you to be mindful, wear safety gear when you're working in all the shrubbery and stuff. Make some noise as you approach so that you don't surprise the critter. They hear you coming. And then replant with storm resistant species that we talked about afterwards. The biggest thing is give plants time to recover. There's a picture here. One of my colleagues wrote a really good blog about wind and sea spray and windburn. And a lot of our trees, you probably saw this, they will get either dried out from the winds and or sometimes also salt burned from salty winds. This is really common. There's nothing you can do to fix it. This is a matter of time. And so all you can do is patience, patience, patience. But don't assume that your plants are dead when you see stuff like this after a storm. I know it's hard to step back and watch everything look like it's dying, but this is all you can do, is apply patience liberally. If there was flooding after the storm, I want you to remove that debris as much as you can. The goal being to restore it to the original soil level. So all that debris you see in that person's yard, all the pieces of twigs and mulch and dirt and branches, all need to come up because as you can see, it's sitting on top of their turf grass. And if we were to get that cleaned up quickly and once this drains, we can wash it out with fresh water, there's a good chance that that turf could recover. The same goes for all the sand. A lot of our beach communities saw a lot of sand pile up on our landscapes. We need to get that sand out of there as quickly as we can, if possible, and try to restore that landscape to as close to pre-storm conditions as we can. Even a couple inches of sand, if we leave it on top of those tree roots, can actually damage and kill the tree, where the tree might have survived the storm, it might have survived the flood. But if we smother it with pounds and tons of sand, the roots are going to die later. And so that's really key to do after a storm. The other thing you can do after a storm is to reach out to us because we have a lot of resources in terms of information. We have the folks that work at our office here and also our Master Gardener volunteers. You can make sure to reach out to ISA certified arborists. As I mentioned, you do not have to be one to be a tree service. So when folks are roaming the neighborhood offering to do pruning for the storm season, I would just implore you to ask them if they're a certified arborist and to get their credentials. We all get a little card with a number and make sure of that so that you're ensuring that your tree won't be damaged structurally, so they'll take better care of it. And then, of course, always listen to any FEMA or state emergency guidelines. There's sometimes pertinent information in there, weather related, that can help you make good decisions, when you're planning.